Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our panel session on the challenges and opportunities for agriculture solutions. We're looking forward to a great discussion. We'll start with introductions. My name is McKenzie Smith. I'm an Associate Director with the Climate Action Reserve. I oversee our agricultural sector, also support our industrial sector and policy more broadly. Work with all the panelists, particularly on our soil enrichment protocol. So looking forward to a great discussion here. So I'll pass it over to Max next to introduce himself.
Max DuBuisson. I'm the head of impact and integrity for Indigo Ag. Indigo is a sustainable agriculture company. We do soil microbial amendments, so seed coatings with beneficial microbes, and then we also have sustainability solutions that include carbon projects and supply chain, like sustainable grain, fiber sourcing programs, working with farmers, change their practices, and connect them with sources of finance to make that happen. Globally, we've got a biological footprint around Europe, India, South America, and the US, and then our sustainability solutions are primarily in the Americas at the moment.
I'm Lucia Von Reusner, Director of Carbon Protocols and Policy at Regrow Ag. Regrow is a digital MRV provider that works with leading food and ag companies to drive footprinting of their Scope 3 and reductions in their Scope 3 as well as in Scope 1. So we use a combination of remote sensing and biogeochemical modeling to help quantify the impacts of ag and the impacts of interventions. We're largely based in the US and Europe with some operations in Australia, I think Brazil. We mainly work on cropping systems, but also some moving into livestock as well.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Jason Ackerson. I'm a research soil scientist and program director at the Soil Health Institute. Soil Health Institute is a small nonprofit focused on enhancing, let me see if I get this right, safeguarding and enhancing the vitality of soils through research and enhancement. What that essentially means is we're a small group of soil scientists, researchers who focus on agricultural sustainability. Particularly, our team focuses a lot on trying to answer the question of how do we measure or quantify soil health, and thinking about ways of communicating that measurement and that change to farmers, growers, people in the supply chain. We are not a MMRV or part of the actual soil carbon marketing industry. We're essentially I would call us like an outside observer set of scientific advisors that contribute in the space but don't necessarily have a financial stake in the success or failures of MMRV services or partners. So happy to be here, be part of the panel.
Great, thank you all. So we'll take about half an hour. We have some questions and discussion planned, but we do want to leave time for your questions as well. First, when we were preparing and talking about the description for this panel discussion, agriculture, I guess we were thinking, what all do we want to talk about under that umbrella? So like any sector, there's different mitigation options, but I think it's safe to say in agriculture that's multiplied further with the idea that it can be on different cropping systems, landscapes, different practice changes, different emission sources, and then it's all happening obviously in a nature-based environment. So yeah, I guess with that perspective in mind, turning it over, I think first to Lucia to talk a bit about your thoughts on that perspective.
Yeah, so agriculture is this hilarious catch-all term for an extremely diverse and complex system all around the world that cannot really be summed up in one word, and yet we try with the word agriculture. But as a whole, agriculture has a lot of opportunities for mitigation. The main sources of agricultural emissions come from land use change, which is a lot of CO2 emissions, so deforestation, grassland conversion, tillage, N2O from fertilizer mostly, and CH4 from methane, mostly for livestock and rice. So N2O and CH4 in particular offer a lot of really important mitigation opportunities because they're extremely potent gases. I think on a 100-year time frame, N2O is about 30 times more potent of a greenhouse gas than CO2, and over a 20-year time frame, it's about 80 times more potent, has a 12-year lifespan. And N2O is about 275 times more potent over a 100-year life cycle than CO2. So huge opportunities to really drop greenhouse gas potential through these mitigation options. There are, and this is particular, there's a lot of opportunity for companies to act on their Scope 3 supply chains to really drive these emissions. So I know this panel will be talking about both Scope 1 and Scope 3, but there's really big opportunity here for companies to drive these changes in their supply chains. And the other opportunity is really around removals. Because ag is a land-based system, there are significant opportunities to invest in restoring biomass into the landscape through cover cropping or no-till or reforestation or things like that, that have a lot of co-benefits for water quality, for biodiversity. So, ag is diverse and complex, but it is a living system and has a lot of opportunity for restoration. And there are a lot of different types of interventions you can go through, but what I generally try to keep in mind to really simplify is trying to trend towards living root cover year-round, so always keeping roots in the ground to keep the soil there, increasing diversity of the system, so increasing types of plants in there, and generally trending towards reducing inputs. And if you're kind of working on those broad 3 strategies, you're creating a more resilient agricultural system, which is really kind of the foundation of why we care about mitigation in this industry.
Thanks, that's great. Yeah, over to you, Jason.
Yeah, I mean, I think, wow, that was a really comprehensive discussion of agriculture. But I think, I want to highlight on a couple, maybe drill down a little deeper on some of the things that Lucia mentioned, this, like, the messiness of agriculture, right? Like, it's a very diverse set of practices. And I think one of the things, and this is probably true of all nature-based solutions, but I think it's particularly relevant in agriculture, is when we think about an intervention or a practice change that a farmer adopts, it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all outcome. I think a really great example of this is something like cover cropping. And a farmer could plant cover crops, and planting cover crops is the intervention, but the actual outcome is having cover crops that actually grow and create biomass that stores carbon or has some other co-benefits. And we see a lot of variability in the actual quality of practice implementation. So I think there's a lot of challenges in the sector for quantifying and codifying how practice quality impacts the actual outcomes we're trying to quantify or commoditize. So I would just highlight that the diversity of agriculture, not only in crop rotations and tillage practices, but also the quality that those practices get implemented in, is a real challenge for the industry, something we need to figure out good tools and methods of quantifying and codifying. And then the other thing I just kind of want to highlight is that part of the word culture in agriculture, right? At the center of these interventions are growers and farmers, and I think Max is going to talk a little bit more about this. But over the last couple of days, we've talked a lot about, the challenges farmers face. There's a lot of benefits, but, one of the things is that adoption decisions aren't always financial. If they were, I think we'd see a lot more adoption. There's a lot of cultural resistance for growers to adopt certain practices. And I think, in the end, with agricultural solutions, we also need to think about solutions for the social system that these growers are embedded in, and making sure we're cognizant of that, both from a quantification perspective, but also from a policy perspective.
Additional thoughts?
Yeah, no, we're at a carbon conference, and so we're going to talk about carbon and soil carbon and co-benefits has been mentioned a couple times. But I think from the farmer's perspective, the carbon is not their point, right? They're like, I'm going to get paid for the carbon, but that's not necessarily interesting to me. So the co-benefits are the point from their perspective. And so I think that's really important for us to think about when thinking about, okay, what are we trying to achieve? What are they trying to achieve? What is the atmosphere trying to achieve? And how do we design programs and projects in a way that everybody's kind of aligned on where we're headed there. And so in some ways, the carbon is kind of a means to an end. But, you know, for the farmer, it's about resilience. So if carbon finance can help get them through the transition into these practices and get, you know, several years into it, and if they're doing it properly, they'll start to see the benefits of soil health, start to become more resilient, and then that in turn reduces risk. So a lot of this comes down to risk, and now they've got less risk from, you know, weather impacts on their crop, but at the same time, they think about risk in terms of adopting these practices. Yeah, there's a financial risk. Oh, it's going to cost me some money to buy cover crop seed or whatever it is. But you know, to the cultural point that Jason was making, it's not just financial, and so that risk calculus that they're doing in their head changes the economics so that it's not just sort of a spreadsheet, but they're going to probably discount those potential benefits coming from it because they're not certain of that. It's not the way that they've done it. And so, again, this is where carbon can help. It can provide this revenue stream to reduce that risk for them. But also, it's a revenue stream that's not coupled to commodity markets or input prices. It's a separate revenue stream. And this allows them to, again, diversify their risk, because, of course, there's risk in carbon markets. I don't think anybody would doubt that. But it's a different source. And so now they're sort of diversifying a bit. I think the last thing I'll say that's in our favor in terms of making these agricultural transitions is the fact that there is a farmer on the land making decisions every year. They can adapt. They can watch things. They can make sure that things are being done properly. And so you've got sort of an ally on the ground, different from maybe, you know, the type of project where somebody just visits the site once a year or something like that, where you make a plan for 30 years and then you kind of got to sit back and see if it plays out. You can adjust and adapt.
Great. Well, thank you all. I think that's a really good way to set things up for the rest of the discussion as we get into more of the details and offers some really good perspectives. I think the next question gets into more of the quantification of these systems. There's a lot of complexities in a lot of sectors, but I think this is uniquely challenged with the different emission sources that need to be quantified, the available models and measurements, and how those are taken from a research perspective into maybe, or hopefully, projects at scale. So maybe getting a little more focused with the panelists in our discussion on quantification approaches and what opportunities and challenges there are today with that. I think I'll go back to Jason first, as he touched on it in some of the opening comments.
Yeah, so I think, you know, quantification is kind of where the rubber meets the road in a lot of these conversations. And, you know, I want to say I'll probably focus strictly on soil carbon in my remarks, but a lot of the ideas translate to other greenhouse gas emissions, you know, nitrogen oxide removals or avoiding emissions. But I think, you know, when I think about how do we scale or actually quantify soil carbon change on a project level, I'm reminded of one of my favorite idioms, which is, you know, the difference between theory and practice is bigger in practice than in theory. And, you know, as soil scientists, as researchers, we've spent the last, you know, several decades figuring out really good ways of quantifying changes in soil properties in time and in space. And so, you know, on a face value, measuring something like a change in soil carbon stock is actually pretty darn simple. You take a soil sample at one time, you measure how much carbon's in it, and you take a soil sample in 5 years' time and you measure how much carbon's in it. Like, that's a really pretty simple measurement modality. But when it really reaches the road of like trying to do that over hundreds of thousands, if not millions of acres, that kind of measurement modality doesn't really work. It doesn't scale economically, it doesn't scale practically, so we need to rely on other tools to try to expand the utility of a limited number of observations. And this is where, you know, companies like the Regrows and the Indigos of the world have really excelled at utilizing biogeochemical models to kind of expand and predict out into the future what those potential changes might be. one of I think the chief challenges in this sector really is once we start relying on a small number of observations to predict outcomes on really large acreages, we're in a space where we're underdetermined in the amount of inputs we have, which results in slightly, not slightly, in large uncertainties. Let's be honest, we have a lot of error in both modeling and in measurement when we start scaling to really big acreages. Compound that by often relatively small deltas in the target variables. Soil carbon doesn't change tremendously over really reasonable short timescales. So we're trying to measure something that changes only slightly with data or predictions that can be really error prone. I want to say I think there's a lot of technical expertise that can mitigate those effects, but we need to acknowledge that uncertainty is something we have to deal with both from a methodological perspective in developing better models and tools, but also in a policy perspective in understanding how that impacts how we might convert emissions reductions or sequestrations into a credit or a commodity. So I think there's a lot of technical nuances we don't want to get into on this panel, but I want to say, like, big picture, right? We know how to measure changes in emissions and carbon concentrations and stocks over time. Like, that is known science. Where it gets hard is trying to do it everywhere all at once. But I also think there's a lot of innovation that's getting us there. And as long as we keep our eye on understanding that uncertainty piece and properly communicating the limitations of that uncertainty, both to the consumer or the buyer or the general public, but also embedding that understanding in policy properly, we're at a position where that challenge, I think, can be mitigated significantly, like I said, both technically and policy-wise. I don't know if that answered the question.
No, I think it's great information. The whole time I was thinking, there's all that complexity with the measurements themselves and, saying we can do it. But then in my world, or all of our worlds, I guess, there's another level of complexity with then what would have happened without the practice change in the baseline. And so, if you're doing measure-remeasure soil measurements, not only is it across the project, but you need a control site, or if you're doing the modeling, you need to be able to model the baseline, and it just adds on. So, no, I appreciate it. I don't know if Lucia or Max, you want to chime in next?
Sure. That was very comprehensive, so thank you. So Regrow, we used a process-based model called DNDC, which I realize I don't know what that stands for, but it's denitrification in there somewhere. Yeah. And it's a very comprehensive process-based model that's been around for over 20 years, has hundreds of peer-reviewed publications about it, has several hundred parameters that feed into it to kind of model the system of interactions between soil microbes, crop types, weather, moisture, to then quantify the changes in SOC and nitrogen and methane. And yeah, it's important to know any model is only a rough representation of reality, and the bigger your sample size is, in general, smaller the uncertainty. But when we go into quantification, you always take an uncertainty deduction at the end. So when you go through like CARSEP and get those CARSEP offsets, they already have a deduction baked in to assume the most conservative outcome to kind of safeguard against over quantifying, and same with like Vera, same with greenhouse gas protocol. And so I think year on year reductions aren't reversible. They're kind of an annual thing. Removals, have that longer time sequence of cumulative returns, and then also the need to, kind of model the reversals and permanence in there as well.
I just want to dwell on the uncertainty point for a second, because I feel like we've had a lot of conversations over the last couple days about soil and quantification and uncertainty, and just like all get on the same page. So when we talk about the uncertainty deduction, if you think about it in reverse, what's happening there in the protocol, it's they take an approach called the probability of exceedance. So it's about your level of confidence in the accuracy of the credits. And with the threshold set in the soil enrichment protocol, you're basically 70% confident that you have underestimated the number of credits you should get. Like, that's That's the way it is
There'll
at the
be
end of the
a
day.
pop quiz at the end.
And so, but it's really important because people talk about, well, soil carbon, it's too uncertain, or like, is this measurement type more uncertain? Is there higher uncertainty over here or lower uncertainty over there? But at the end of the day, every credit achieves that exact same level of confidence, regardless of the level of uncertainty. It just means if you had higher uncertainty, you had a bigger deduction to reach that level of confidence. And so I don't know if that's like sunk in all the conversations we've had. So I wanted to make sure that, that we put it out there. So the nice thing about this is it sort of provides guardrails and incentives for project developers to innovate. So we use the DayCent model. To use that, we have to get validation data sets. So published studies that have studied the thing that we want to use the DayCent model for. We have to get these studies and assess the performance. And through the end of that, we get this, assessment of uncertainty, the model prediction error. DayCent can do things that we don't use it for, but we would have higher model prediction error. And so now it's a business decision, right? Do we want to model things that we have less validation data? Well, if the error is too high, then we won't get any credits for it. So let's not do that. Let's focus on things that we can reduce uncertainty. But also, the way this, sort of 70% confidence level works is it's never zero. Unless you had zero uncertainty, which is not really going to happen, there's a constant incentive to innovate, to do better, to get more data, rather than some of the older uncertainty approaches that some of the protocols took, where it was like anything above 10% uncertainty at a certain confidence interval, like it was impossible to explain to a buyer for sure, but also at the end of the day, it basically said you can have a certain amount of uncertainty in your credits, whereas here, you're always taking some sort of deduction. So I think it's important that as buyers and others looking at the marketplace, looking at soil carbon credits or projects, looking at the actual methodology and how it handles uncertainty is important, and it can be confusing, but it can then give you confidence in the credits themselves.
And also one other thing to note is that for SOC credits, for like Vera and CAR, the model itself also undergoes its own independent audit in addition to the project. So you kind of have two rigorous audits that go through.
Yeah, that's a great point. All great points. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, you kind of started, I think, to touch on it, Max, with uncertainty and aggregation when we were discussing the panel, or when I was thinking about it, and what's unique or a big challenge and opportunity. I think it's safe to say most of the room, I'm sure, knows or assumes that agriculture projects, or for us, like a soil enrichment project, isn't one field or two fields. It's much larger than that, and that's needed for a number of reasons to succeed in the market. So I think focusing in on that as to maybe why that's needed from different perspectives, as well as what are some of the opportunities that gives, but then on the flip side, what are the challenges, administratively or programmatically or technically. So I don't know who would like to take a stab at that first, but maybe Max, I think you were
Sure.
maybe going there with uncertainty.
Yeah, and I think, Jason kind of spoke a little bit on the measurement side, how doing it at scale, you get more measurements, you can start to help control uncertainty even more. So it's not, these sorts of approaches don't really work at the single field level in terms of running models, because there's so much variability within the field in this small effect size of the carbon change, and you'd have to take thousands of samples within, sample the whole field or something to get enough sort of data population to bring down uncertainty. So aggregating is really important. Now, there's plenty of other reasons that we need to aggregate. Also, just running a carbon project on one field just isn't really going to work for a business. You're not going to generate a lot of credits, and you're going to spend a lot of money. So bringing a lot of farms together, you can build a program that scales. For us, we do it through software. So we built a data collection software platform so that thousands of growers, they can all enter the data themselves or work with partners to help enter the data. But the platform itself can handle, as the number of growers scale. And then we're able to take it up to, quantification of the entire portfolio. And so we take, across all the different diverse crops and geographies and end up with one kind of project level total. And that's where we're assessing the uncertainty. And then based on the actual practices that each farmer adopted, we can estimate, what was their contribution to the total pie. And so each of them gets allocated back a number of credits, so that they can get paid on that. And in this way, again, it protects the farmers a bit in terms of risk. If one farmer, has a bad year, the whole project doesn't go down. We can work with them and they can have a better year the next year. But it's sort of like being part of an insurance pool in some ways for healthcare. You've got a larger system and you're in it with everybody else. And if you all do well, the whole pool succeeds there. It also helps in terms of managing the permanence of the carbon. So we can look at permanence again at that pool level. So think about it like a bank, and each of these fields is a different account in the bank. We've got deposits and withdrawals happening, and we're working with these farmers to increase deposits, decrease withdrawals, so that the whole thing comes up. But in a given year, at the system level, is the level of carbon stable or increasing? Then we can maintain permanence of the credits themselves.
Yeah, that was comprehensive, and I think we have a lot of clients that initially come to us that want to do a small project just to try things out, to de-risk themselves, and it just doesn't work like that. Like you're gonna have high uncertainty, you're gonna have farmers dropping out, you're gonna have high programmatic costs, and so it's really like go big or go home. Like be ambitious, have a region that you really think has good potential, and bring in that portfolio of farmers, and you just get economies of scale, and the model is just going to work better, and you're going to have more of an impact. So go big or go home.
I have nothing to add.
That is totally okay. I'm just watching the time and want to make sure we leave some time for questions. I think, though, to first kind of wrap things up from our discussion, agriculture is a relatively new sector, of course, especially in like carbon markets and carbon accounting. There's lots of new science, technologies, data, availability challenges. We're in the middle of a major update to our soil enrichment protocol, and all three panelists sit on our technical work group and are helping discuss some of these challenges and make improvements to the protocol moving forward. And it feels like as we're discussing it, things are being updated in real time, so it's very challenging. My question for the panelists is, what do you see as sort of the next opportunity or challenge maybe that we have discussed maybe at the SEP work group or in other discussions here at the conference, or other things that you've thought about additional to that? So open floor for anything that pops up.
Well, I think protocols are kind of by design somewhat simplified and reductionistic to help you focus and streamline and standardize. But the reality is, agriculture is a complex living system that needs a holistic approach. And so really keeping that in mind as you're designing your system, and also as protocols are being written, like how do you enable holistic interventions that really regenerate the landscape and allow for the reality of the diversity and complexity that this system realistically is. I think the other is livestock. It's really complicated. I don't know of many projects out there. Protocols aren't really there. Data's not really there. But methane's a huge, potent greenhouse gas, so it's really something that has to be in. But cows move. They're hard to measure, so it's another reason you have models.
Am I next?
If you'd like to be sure.
Yeah,
Sorry.
sure. I think this is a really exciting space, and to me, the protocols and the work that are being done in the registries is only a part of the sliver. I think what's really exciting is seeing a lot of the innovation that's happening, both in the modeling space, folks developing new biogeochemical models, but also we have multiple firms now that are doing proximal sensing to measure soil carbon stocks. And seeing models move in a way that, the registries move in a way that allows for innovation and new sensors or new technologies or new modes of measuring carbon stocks or carbon stock changes into those models is really exciting. We're seeing some traction with Vera as well in that regard. So like that makes me really excited because I think ultimately the innovation in the measurement space is really what's going to drive a lot of reductions in uncertainty, but also consumer confidence. Like I think it's a lot easier to articulate to someone why a measure remeasure is a tractable way of measuring carbon stock change versus a measure and model. Not to say that I have no confidence in the models, but I think it's way easier for me to explain to my grandma what measure remeasure is. And I think ultimately, that's the way we need to think about buyers, is communicating that really simply. So I'm excited about that. And the other thing that I've been excited about from the last couple of days is talking to people in the Scope 3 world. Like outside of generating registered credits, I think there's a lot of cool things that can happen in Scope 3 with aligning farmer incentives and supply chain incentives so that everybody's getting, something really good out of the picture. We get reduction in carbon as a society, better greenhouse gas outcomes. Growers get payments, but also we're seeing an alignment of incentives that might not have been there otherwise, where you have a CPG who now is more invested in their growers other than just a source of cheap corn.
It would be good to be able to describe biogeochemical models or even understand them more simply. That would be great.
Yeah, I mean, that's the biggest challenge, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, there's plenty of challenges in the development of the project itself, but when I think big picture, communicating the complexity around this and not just throwing up our hands. Like forestry is complex. We've just been talking about it for longer, right? Direct air capture, I don't understand the chemistry going on there, but we all sort of are like, but that's cool. They figured it out. But nobody says that's cool. They figured it out with soil carbon. They say, I don't think you know what you're doing. I mean, not in so many words, but pretty much that's what
I
people
actually have heard those exact words this week. So
I
Was it
feel
a
like
farmer?
that
sounds like something, yeah.
every panel.
Farmers have told us that's for sure. But I think, opportunities. I think remote sensing is super useful now, getting even more useful. The data, as we move forward in time, we're getting better remote sensing data, higher resolution, going from 30-meter pixel to a 10-meter pixel unlocks all sorts of things. And if you get even, smaller than that, and then with these projects, we've, within our carbon project, we've probably taken, 150, 180,000 soil samples. We've collected millions of management data points. Like now we've got something that we can start to work with the remote sensing and ask it some questions and figure some things out. I think continued research to produce validation data sets, continue to expand the scope of use of these models, but also innovation in the construction of the models themselves, ensemble modeling, modular modeling, taking the best of this model, this one over here, putting them together into a model that is, better than the sum of its parts. For us personally, the biologicals I mentioned, like we are continuing to explore how those can interact in the carbon project and where we can identify soil microbes that are going to increase the carbon in the soil and help crops put down roots deeper. Scope 3, really exciting for us, and being able to offer, both carbon and Scope 3 in different times on the same field. And then I think there's some opportunities around insurance in both the permanent space is kind of the first place people's brains go to, but also just risk management, even for the farmers. They've got crop insurance on their crop. Could they have crop insurance for their carbon crop to, again, reduce that risk, make them more confident to move forward?
Great. Well, we hope that covered some interesting topics, different opportunities, challenges, without getting too much into the details, and saving some time for more discussion and questions from you all. I don't know, is there anything else on the panel that you wanted to add before we turn it over for questions? Not to put you on the spot, but
I'm happy to hear some questions.
Okay, let's turn to questions.
I'm sick of hearing from us.
Right here.
I'm Evan Edgar from the California Compost Coalition. One of the co-benefits we're seeing is biodiversity, and I've been hearing potential credits for biodiversity for the first time at this conference. I represent rangeland in California. We have proof of concept for the last 3 years they're their hosts, and then we use that compost on the ranch. And the ranchers, so far, is over the moon about the biodiversity coming back and how that could be a future parlay. I want to know more about that a little bit. And then we have application to Vera 0042 on all the rangelands in California. We got 4 ranches so far, and working with the California Rangeland Trust, we're going to bring to 20 to 25 because we got to get the green waste out of the landfill and we take it to the ranches. It's a great model, and the biodiversity could be another parlay. Any questions? Any?
No, I mean, we think about it a lot, and you know, I think it's always a choice of, do you take an extra benefit like that and try to create something else, so you sell the carbon over here and sell the biodiversity over here, or will you get sort of more value by kind of keeping it together and making more premium carbon? And I mean, that's kind of where we are today. There are, you know, nascent biodiversity markets. I think there it's less about using it like an offset and more about a sort of verified claim that you've invested and created an impact, which is, I think, the way to go. Yeah.
Good answer. Thank you. That helps me a lot.
I also-
200,000 tons the first year.
Nice.
Next year, so we're pretty excited.
Yeah, I also think of biodiversity as another like hilariously oversimplified catch-all word for the diversity of all life. Whereas carbon is, you know, a unit of something that's kind of, you have one thing. I think the challenge has been measuring and pricing the diversity of all life happening within your project area. Yeah.
I saw a question over here.
Couple of questions or experiences. One is just the question that I can influence are asking, where's specialty crops in this conversation? And California, you're here in California, that's what California grows. But I keep seeing rules being written that just don't quite work for specialty crops. So taking almonds as an example, you know, once you've planted an orchard, it's actually a pretty stable ecosystem for the next 20, 25 years. You don't switch crops every year or so forth. Or vice versa, if you're doing vegetable crops, you may have 2 or 3 crops in a year, depending on where you're growing here in California. So how do we model these things that are really different than what we have been thinking about for row crops? I'm just being really stark here because we've been working on trying to get some of this modeling and running into, oh, we don't have enough data. And I'm like, almonds, along with data from grapes and walnuts, does not have enough data in special crops, and I don't know who will. So I'm trying to understand those rules, but I'm also, as we're talking about that uncertainty, I'm sort of going, well, actually, data cropping systems do have more certainty because you don't have that variability from year to year in terms of planting choices. So how do you account for that? You know, vice versa, everybody seems to want to have data every year, and I'm sitting there going, things don't change, the soil doesn't change that quickly, we don't change our irrigation systems from year to year. You know, why do you want data from growers every year? That does not make sense to me. So there's a bunch of things about how these systems have been set up where I'm struggling to figure out, for almonds specifically, and for special crops in particular, how do we fit into these conversations? How do we fit into these models? Fortunately, serving is something we on the board funded the initial research on. We have this, we wound up in Trinity at the lifespan, put in this intuitively major slow release carbon. But modeling is done on an annual basis. The modelers go, how do we do this? Okay? So that's really the question I'm having is how do we become part of that conversation? How do we influence these conversations? Especially with California that is a leader in working on climate smart ag for California crops.
I'll start maybe. I think that's a great question. We get a lot of questions at the reserve around our soil enrichment protocol of, I have an almond crop or I have an orchard, and can I do a project? Can I do a soil enrichment project or an agriculture project? And oftentimes our answer is you could, you can. There's nothing in the protocol necessarily that says you can't, but then the limitations, as you've mentioned, are data availability or models that are capable of doing, modeling on those certain crops for whatever reasons. And so that's sort of where we see, unfortunately, projects run into barriers. So from our perspective, at least at the reserve, I think it's safe to say, like, we would want to include those crops and see positive actions on more than just row crops. But it seems to be that the projects that are starting are ones that have that, I guess, data and modeling capacities at this time. So I don't know, that's a start of a response. I don't know if maybe anyone else on the panel wanted to add. I don't know, Jason, if you have thoughts on soil carbon and almonds and orchards.
Maybe not almonds specifically, but I think the question does highlight, one of our challenges in the space with the models that we have access to. And this is I think a good call for action to any nascent model developers in the room. A lot of the models we rely on in the sector were specifically designed and calibrated for a set of ecosystems or agroecosystems. And most of the time that doesn't include specialty crops. Almonds are a great example of this. I don't think that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that Descent was really tooled up to work in almonds. And so there's a research need here that someone needs to step in and build models that are flexible enough that can handle multiple crops with different phenologies that really can work for a diversity of places. I know CSU is working on sort of their next generation of models that are really focusing on thinking about how that phylogeny can be better pulled into the model. But I think it's a fair criticism of the modeling space. But I also think it reflects the fact that it takes years and years of investment, often not funded by the industry, but by federal research dollars, to develop the models that can work in these spaces. And scientifically, there's nothing, I think, stopping it other than the time and effort it takes to get one of these models tuned up, calibrated, or maybe modified to work in those spaces. So I don't know if that's a really edifying answer, but I think it's as honest as I can be that we haven't built, as a research community, we haven't built models that work everywhere.
I will say that we have had a TNDC model that got developed 10 years ago, got updated, but we're still stumbling with not having enough data to meet whatever those requirements are. And so then you're sitting here going, as I say, almond board funds research, a lot of special crops don't have that capacity. So then it's like, okay, if the data we have is not enough, then I don't know what other special crops are going to have the data. I'm just being very honest here. We are, in the California world, often cited like, hey, we're on the cutting edge. And then it's like, no. And again, I'm saying, I'm just sort of raising it and saying, hey, let's
Yeah.
figure out how to talk some more about it. Or is it something, I'm just going to toss this out there, where some alternative thinking might be relevant, but in a completely different space. Do we need as many trials for crops that don't have as many acres? I mean, is there something where we think about how many, what variability are we managing and how much data do we need for that? Because I've seen that in other spaces, completely different pesticide residue testing for international MRL standards, where they've set up different numbers of trials based on acreage and or consumption data. So again, I think some creative thinking. And then I think one other thing that came out of this morning's conversation, just the other question for me to think about is, coming back to that uncertainty, one of the big issues we have growers who have adopted practices already made a difference. And because it's not considered additional, they are left out. And yet, that's where we actually know changes have been taking place, and we don't have a way of valuing that. And so I think, and any changes that's happened in the last 10 years, and the next 10 years is actually more valuable than something 50 years from now. And again, we haven't figured out how do we value that kind of innovation, even if it's not there for 100 years or even 50 years, because again, the permanence is a big hurdle, especially on the carbon removal side. So I think some more thinking in that space would also be good, at least from my perspective. Just thoughts on that.
Yeah, Great comments. I mean, just to follow up on maybe what Jason had said too, like at the reserve, we don't have a model that has to be used, or not just, sampling design. There's requirements in the protocol that the models and sampling need to meet, but trying to stay agnostic to bring in new research and models and everything that can do more on more crop types and things. So I agree. I think that is a gap. Like I said, we get a lot of questions on specialty crops, or grazing. Improved grazing is another maybe area that's looking for a model or trying to model these things, and so a lot's happening. Did you have a point on that? Okay, I see the question over here, but I don't know if this is a follow-up. Okay.
Or an and follow-up, because you check the L out of it, right? So, a few thoughts. First of all, maybe the soil enrichment protocol isn't the right protocol, and maybe that's the area of innovation rather than modeling. Maybe there needs to be an almond-specific or a tree crop-specific model, because if you think about it, the carbon's going into the tree in addition to the soil, and so that's an area of consideration. And then following a point that Jason made, which is measure, remeasure is easy to explain to your grandma. Maybe we don't need a model at all for almonds. Maybe it's just measure, remeasure. You go out and you take a diameter of breast height, estimate how much carbon is in that tree, and then if you're doing whole orchard recycling, go out and whatever appropriate method of determining the carbon in that residue over time, whether it's a 5-year cycle or a 25-year cycle, whatever that may be, maybe that's the approach. So perhaps it's just a new protocol with a measure, remeasure, or some type of IPCC equations that can link to tree carbon. So maybe it's an easy solution. And then also amplifying what Gabrielle said, carbon markets need to consider early adopter solutions and rethink the concept of additionality.
Interesting points. The whole time I was thinking of, I guess from our side of things, and protocol boundaries, and is it a new protocol or the same protocol? And we have our soil enrichment protocol, but we also have our nitrogen protocol and our rice management protocol for California, but we have a rice project that's doing soil enrichment, but methane reduction, and other fields that are doing other things. So it gets complicated from an administrative standpoint of the question around, is it more efficient to develop a new protocol for this, or improve the current one? So that's where my mind was going with that question, but I don't know if there's anything to add from the panelists. I do see a question over here. The patient.
I'm not sure why we're concerned with efficiency.
Okay.
I do think just on the point of early adopters, I mean, carbon markets were set up to pay for practice change, and it's a pretty limited pool of money. And so if there's no practice change happening, it's hard to claim like a reduction or removal. But I think Scope 3 offers an opportunity for those early adopters through low emission factor footprint crops. And we have seen clients who have dramatically expanded business with certain customers through their low emission factor corn, which that doesn't have causality, additionality, anything like that. And it's a bit more of like almost like a certification of, your practices are better than the average. But I do think it's just important to remember that like carbon markets were set up for a very specific thing. It's a very limited pot of money, and it can't fund everything, but that there are other opportunities to fund, things.
Yeah, totally agree with that.
Good point. Patiently waiting. Thank you. You're.
When work for eco engineers, I don't want to offend anyone. I understand that it's different, but agriculture and golf courses is, something I'm working on, and creating credit programs for golf courses, maintenance of them. One of the issues is cost. Despite what the media portrays, there's very low budgets to pay for this type of involvement. Similar to what you were talking
Yeah. I mean, the first thing is the farmers don't pay for it. We do. And so that's good. But it is expensive. But the worst thing actually is that it takes a long time. I'd be happy to pay more for it if it took half as much time. So we've been doing a lot of thinking about, how can it take less time? How can it be easier? We've moved from in-person site visits to virtual site visits. And so that has helped quite a bit. There's a lot less flying around. It takes less time. And, they're verifying something that happened a year ago. So they're not seeing the activity happen if they visit it physically anyway. They might be growing a different crop in the rotation this year. But on the, Zoom call with a cell phone, they can see, you can tell the difference in crop residue, between no-till and tilled and things like that. And they can interview the farmer. That kind of thing helps. There's, I think just as we move into more digitalization of the MRV, so the data collection itself, managing those streams of data, presenting them in a way that the verifier can, easily go through them, being able to use remote sensing, again, to help validate data and increase the confidence that the verifier is having, reducing, all the manual steps and just, working with the registries to see, how can the actual registry operations kind of enable more of this digital flow so that you can cut out a lot of the time, because it's just a really complex process with a lot of little steps, and each one, if you add a day or two here and there, suddenly you've added 2 months to the whole process. So I think there's a lot of things that can be done there, and there's a lot of people working on it. It's not like something people are ignoring.
Yeah, I think digital MRV offers a lot of opportunities for cost savings, streamlinings, et cetera, but it's a new set of tools that auditors don't necessarily understand at first. So I think upfront auditor education is something that we've been really trying to do, just like outside the audit cycle, have sit downs and explain like this is how remote sensing works and like, et cetera. I also heard at an earlier panel talk about the concept of like, I forget, like process, like auditing the process or auditing the product, like your digital MRV system, as a way to like speed up some of that like underlying infrastructure audit, so that way you're really just focusing on maybe some core data points going through the specific projects. Could be interesting. But yeah, I think that's the goal of the entire industry, to get better, faster, stronger.
Another question, I think we've got, did you have a question? Yeah? Yeah.
Christina McCain with GeoOptics. You mentioned that remote sensing data is sort of getting better and better in terms of helping to estimate soil carbon at quantities. I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about what data types are emerging. Are you finding most promising in terms of that estimation, or what are the challenges with some of those
Yeah.
opportunities with technology?
Well, I can clarify, we're not using it for measurement. So, yeah. Well, it's something that we get asked a lot, is, are we actually using remote sensing to estimate soil carbon? No, we are using it to understand practice changes and land cover and land use and changes in land cover and practices over time. And that way, there's a few different things we can do. One is just making it easier for farmers to get into the program by looking at the crops being grown year after year. We've got models that can then infer what are the actual boundaries of a field. And so now we've got a national field boundary map, and the grower wants to sign up, we can say, is this your boundary? Rather than them starting with a map and trying to like draw it, because a lot of them are not good at that. And so that sort of thing, kind of helping, we can look at what kind of crop was being grown, some of the practices. So then we can say, it looks like, you were growing corn this year. Is that correct? Okay, great, confirm. All of it just sort of reducing their friction on their end, rather than just having a blank slate for the farmer and saying, you tell me everything. And then data validation. So once they do tell us everything, we can assess, is this similar to what our tillage detection algorithm was saying? They're saying they're no-till, but we were actually seeing tillage. All right, we got to flag that, go back and sort it out with them. We also have to look historically. We have to look at practices that were happening before they changed their practices, but we also have to look a full 10 years before they changed to make sure that they weren't, converting forest land into cropland, something like that. And that's an area where some of the historical data, especially when we started, the project started in 2018, so we were looking back to 2008. Some of it was kind of spotty back then, and it wasn't as useful of a tool. So as we get farther in time, we're getting higher resolution and more frequent imagery that's enabling, more accurate inferences.
Just a couple more minutes. Is there any final questions? Sure.
Lucia.
Lucia.
You mentioned nitrous oxide. And I have a question on this, maybe it goes across the panel, because I mean, everybody looks at it because it's such a much more complicated gas, but I know like Air Resources Board 15 years ago thought, oh, this is low-hanging fruit, and then realized you're trying to make soil microbes behave, and I realized it was not low-hanging fruit. So I'm just curious, from your perspective, you're not looking at reducing the nitrogen amount supplied, either changing the type of nitrogen or doing something else. What are the opportunities for reducing N2O emissions?
I'm going to say this is outside of my area of expertise.
It's an interesting question. Before my time here at the Reserve, I was working with the fertilizer industry in Canada, and we promoted the 4R nutrient stewardship, right source, right time and place. I think it is a lot more complicated maybe than the sustainability sector or people, the carbon market sector understand. I think soil carbon is a lot more complicated than nitrogen. I don't know if everyone agrees or disagrees with that. I don't know, Jason, if you
Wait, did you say soil carbon was more complicated than nitrogen?
I
I would disagree by
don't
orders
think
of
so.
magnitude.
I
I think
think-
Ross
yeah.
is nodding with
Yeah.
me. Yeah.
I
No,
think people think that. I mean, I
Yeah.
think people think put on less nitrogen or put it below the soil and problem solved, and maybe they think there's more complexities. But
Yeah.
to the question, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the nitrogen, if we could get rid of N2O emissions, we would have the global warming potential benefit, or reduction in global warming potential is so huge. But it's such a hard thing. Like, speaking from the measurement perspective, just knowing when those N2O emissions happen in the field is so hard. And there's a lot of research in the soil science space on, how do we accurately quantify N2O emissions, both temporally but also spatially. And a lot of the research is pointing towards, what people are calling hot spots and hot moments, where you might have a whole field and just, maybe 5% of it's actually contributing N2O emissions, but they're happening in these very local places at very specific times of the year. And thinking about that from an MMRV perspective of you want to measure that nitrous oxide emissions, not that that's a scalable MMRV, but it's needed to really understand these dynamics. That means you have to have somebody with a gas analyzer out in the field at 4:30 a.m. on a Wednesday at this exact GPS location. So I think the comment around nitrogen is well received. We should be doing more to focus on how do we build systems that incentivize growers to reduce N2O emissions. I'm not sure a crediting mechanism is a viable approach there, just because of the certainty needed and the lack of tools right now to quantify it. There's a lot of work and people trying to develop deployable in-field N2O sensors, but those are nascent projects, right? They're in the very early stages of people even being able to commercialize them, let alone get them out and scalable. So I think there's a lot of challenges there. But someone who runs DNDC might know more about N2O or how we credit it.
I cannot take credit for building DNDC, but we have a team if anyone wants follow-up questions. And I will say, I think the NERP protocol in Canada is for nitrogen, and
I love that.
they're NERP. Basically, it says if you use the 4 Rs and someone signs off on it, just assume a 25% deduction and like you're good to go. And I think that's like the cutting edge of the science right now.
Yeah,
I
there's
mean-
3 levels, yeah, 15, 20, 25%, I think, with the different levels, yeah.
I mean, it is accounted for in SEP projects, and we are modeling it with DayCent. We're modeling the direct N2O, and we're using the IPCC equations for the indirect N2O, again, because of the problem studying it and the validation data to validate model performance. But you can model it, but you need pretty significant changes, at least if in total in applied, to make that really make any difference. Now you can have, you know, again, and with the timing and form and, you know, some of the slow release, things like that, you can chip away at it. But the impacts of the soil carbon changes completely dwarfs it at the project level.
Great discussion. I think we're 2 minutes over time, so thank you to the panelists. Really appreciate it. Thank you all for joining us.